Exotic particle generator builds, or EPG for short, are very different from your typical builds in Star Trek Online. Most are more weapons focused, whereas these are much more focused on creating exotic damage through various anomalies, usually through either science abilities, certain specialization abilities, or through consoles. Even after all these years of playing Star Trek Online, I still find them kind of weird and confusing, which is why I've never done a video on them until now. But I really want to like the Premonition, so let's see what I can put together.
It's just now dawning on me that this is actually going to be the first EPG build video on the channel. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not the biggest fan of EPG builds. Like, they're cool, they're interesting, but they're weird, and they're very much outside my skill set and line of thinking when it comes to builds in Star Trek Online. You know me, I like flying large bulky cruisers that fire beam arrays in every direction. But EPG builds are sciencey space magic builds that rely on throwing gravity wells and other anomalies at enemies. Though I guess the other upside here is that EPG builds are also very big on AoE attacks, so they're very good for killing large groups of enemies at once rather than single target builds, which I like even less than EPG builds, honestly. Of course, none of that would have been an issue if they had just made the Premonition a temporal battlecruiser like I had hoped they would. This can often be a downside whenever Star Trek Online releases a ship like this, because remember, the Premonition is not a Star Trek Online original ship. This was originally a ship introduced in the video game Star Trek Armada. And that's the big reason why I've been looking forward to this ship so much, is because I was a huge fan of Star Trek Armada, and I've always really loved the look of the Premonition in particular. And it can really suck when Star Trek Online finally releases one of your favorite ships, only to find out that they gave it stats that don't suit your favorite playstyle at all. But I am determined to like this ship, so I got my friend Galactic Gaming to help me out with putting together a full EPG build for the Premonition. Speaking of, if you're not already following Galactic Gaming, you should go follow her YouTube channel. She also does her own Star Trek Online builds and has more content based around EPG builds, so if you're interested in finding out more about those, go check out her channel. Okay, enough jabbering from me, let's get into the build. In the forward weapon slots, we've got nothing but torpedoes, and that's because torpedoes and EPG mesh really well together. EPG builds require you to put the bulk of your power into your auxiliary subsystem, which means there usually isn't a lot left for your weapon power, but fortunately, torpedo damage does not scale with weapon power, so it's not really a problem for them. Now, you don't want to just use any torpedoes. I'm using these four in particular for a reason. The Enhanced Biomolecular Photon Torpedo, which comes from the 8472 reputation, is here because, one, it is a very powerful torpedo, just from the sheer amount of kinetic damage it's able to put out, but its molecular incubation ability means it's capable of putting out some extra radiation damage. Radiation damage is really good for an EPG build because it is a form of exotic damage, so therefore that radiation damage is going to be buffed by all your other exotic damage buffs. The Delphic Distortion Torpedo, which comes from the Lobi store, is capable of reducing enemy damage resistance, and it also gets an extra boost when under the effect of Torpedo High Yield, firing an additional torpedo under the effect that it normally would. Next is the Particle Emission Plasma Torpedo, which is here for its ability to drop plasma particle emission clouds, which will create more plasma damage over time. That plasma damage over time is an exotic form of plasma damage, so it'll also be buffed by your EPG stuff. This weapon is actually crafted from the R&D menu. You can find it in the Projectile School of the R&D crafting menu, and I think it unlocks at level 15, or alternatively, you can just buy one on the exchange. And the last torpedo is the Gravimetric Photon Torpedo from the Dyson reputation, which is here for its ability to create gravimetric rifts. If you're missing any of these, because I know the Particle Emission Torpedo can be a pain to get, and the Delphic Distortion Torpedo is a Lobi store item, as an alternative for one of these, you could swap in the Neutronic Torpedo from the Delta reputation. That one also does a pretty decent amount of radiation damage. In the F section, I've got a bunch of mine launchers, because there's no such thing as an omnidirectional torpedo launcher. Specifically, I'm using Thoron-infused quantum mines because they have a chance to apply unstable Thoron radiation anytime they hit an enemy. You can find these in the Dilithium store of the Delta Alliance reputation. In the core gear, first is the Revolutionary Deflector. It comes with some okay buffs to exotic particle damage and control expertise, but the main reason this is here is for the 2-piece bonus with the shield, which is giving a really nice buff to the crit severity of my exotic damage. The secondary deflector is a deteriorating secondary deflector, which I got from the Draenor Fleet Colony. The secondary deflectors from the Draenor Colony have a modifier on them that gives a little extra projectile damage, which can be nice because I am still using projectile weapons on this thing. But the really important part is that it is a deteriorating secondary deflector, because that is what will be adding some radiation damage over time to your science debuff abilities, like Tachyon Beam and Charged Particle Burst. The engine is just the competitive reputation engine for the extra speed buff. For the warp core, I am using the Tholian Nucleating Warp Core, which I know you guys have been seeing this one a lot on the channel, but it really is useful on this build because all those warp crystals deal radiation damage, which that's kind of what EPG builds are all about. And like I said, the Revolutionary Shield for the two-piece with the deflector. Now, both the Tholian and Revolutionary sets were both event gear, so it is possible that you do not have access to those. If you don't have the Tholian set, but you do have the Revolutionary set, you could swap out the warp cores from each set, and therefore you'd be able to fire off mycelial rifts. Honestly, they're not really super powerful, and the cooldown of them is quite a long time, but it's not bad. Or if you don't have either set, you can use pieces of the core set from the Temporal Reputation. In fact, before the Revolutionary set, that was the meta for EPG for a long time. The devices are, for the most part, just my usual allotment. The main difference is the batteries that I'm using, which are Exotic Particle Floods. These give a plus 20 bonus damage to all exotic damage, and the advanced versions also give a plus 5 to auxiliary power. Now, let's move on to the consoles. And truth is, the consoles are the main reason why I find EPG builds so freaking confusing. With energy weapons, I could just throw on a bunch of ISO mags. Torpedo builds still use the old vulnerability locators and exploiters. Pet builds can just load up on the advanced hangar bay consoles. And yes, there are advanced consoles for science, but everything I've been told is that you should still be relying on the universal consoles instead, and they're all over the place. It's so hard to keep track of what's best in slot for an EPG build, let alone other science builds like DoSci or control builds. So yeah, once again, shout out to Galactic Gaming for helping me out with this mess. Starting off was actually a console that was actually really familiar to me, Adaptive Energy Systems, which is off the Sojourner. This is here for its 30% bonus damage buff to all damage. Because it's an all damage buff, this will buff my weapons, plus my bridge officer abilities and my console abilities. So it's really valuable here, much in the same way it is on pretty much any other kind of damage build. Next is Subspace Fracture Tunneling Field off of the Tier 6 Obelisk, and this one's kind of obvious, it's here to lower the cooldowns of my universal consoles. I've been seeing a lot of people joke around that this is the new Frank's Red Hot console, because, you know, putting that crap on everything. And it's true, the amount of cooldown reduction this thing is able to give your universal consoles, including itself, is kind of ridiculous. Okay, now let's get into the weirder stuff. Delphic Terror Generator. This console is actually really great for EPG builds, both for its passives and its clickability. The passive gives a plus 20% bonus damage buff to exotic damage, which, again, everything here is exotic damage, so that's really nice, plus an additional 5% crit severity, which is also really nice. And the click ability is multiple pulses of radiation damage that will fire out in a cone attack, meaning that'll hit multiple enemies in your forward arc with radiation damage. Not only will that radiation damage increase with the amount of targets it's hitting, but it also has 50% shield penetration, and any targets within the effect will also get minus 22 damage resistance rating. This console is available through the Infinity lockboxes, but it is not attached to any ship, so you can just buy it straight off the exchange. The same is actually true of the next two consoles. The first one being Constriction Anchor. This one is an okay console, its clickability is absolute garbage, but the main reason you want this one here is for its passive ability, which is plus 25.3% bonus exotic damage. The next one is Cutting Tractor Beam. The clickability on this one is a bit better. It spawns a little generator and then it will deal some kinetic damage to enemies nearby. But this is another one where the main reason you want it is the passive ability. In this one's case, anytime you activate a universal console, you will get a 10% bonus damage buff to all of your universal consoles. And that bonus damage stacks, so you want to keep activating your universal consoles, which on an EPG build you already want to keep doing. Going back up here, I've got the Dragon's Blood Flame Reactor off of the Hysperion Intel Battlecruiser. The passive on this console gives 20% bonus Disruptor, Fire, Cold, Electrical, Radiation, and Psionic damage, all of which, except for Disruptor, are exotic forms of damage, and it gives a bit of a buff to your engine power. The click ability fires off a cone of fire damage that will scale with your engine power. While the ability is active, it will continually drain your engine power, so it will get progressively weaker over time, but honestly, it's really not that much of a problem, as long as you keep a good amount of power in your engine subsystem. Next is the Auxiliary Ejection Assembly off of the Kelvin Constitution Heavy Cruiser. That's the lockbox version that's also a command ship. This is another console that is mainly here for its passive bonuses. This one giving a small buff to your auxiliary subsystem power levels, as well as a plus 19% bonus damage buff to your exotic damage. The clickability itself, though, is more for utility than anything else. What it does is fire off several auxiliary warp cores behind you, which will then explode. The explosion will then thrust you forward, giving you a decent speed and turn rate buff. The explosions will do some kinetic damage to anything caught within them, but because they're setting off behind you while you're moving, it is kind of difficult to kind of target where things are going to be while you're passing through them, so it's not a reliable source of damage. But the speed buff itself here can be kind of useful, but like I said, the main reason to have this console is for its passives. The next console is actually weirdly similar to the previous one in a handful of ways, the first of which being that it is from another variation of the Constitution, this one being from the wretched and terrible Constitution 3. Bioelectric Wave Capacitor is actually a very strong console on an EPG build. Its passives, for the most part, aren't that useful. The energy weapon damage and the weapon power not going to be at all useful here, but that bonus electrical damage, that's definitely going to be useful here because this console deals electrical damage, and, electrical damage is a form of exotic damage, as I've said previously. What the click ability does is creates a bioelectric wave that you can then kind of surf off of. You and any allies will gain a significant speed and turn rate buff, as well as some buffs to current subsystem power, but any enemies that make contact with the wave will receive a big hit of electrical damage. And unlike the previous ejection assembly console, this one hits like a freaking truck. The next console is Exotic Particle Field Exciter. Now this one is a little bit of a pain in the butt to get, at least this specific one with this EPG mod on it. This console is just here for your exotic particle generator skill. It's also increasing my shield capacity and up my weapon power for a short time, not that that's really useful at all here. It's the EPG skill buff that I'm after for this. There are other versions of this console, but I'm using this one specifically because it has that EPG mod, meaning it's giving an even bigger buff to the exotic particle generator skill. But this console with this specific mod is kind of a huge pain in the ass to get. For one, you have to craft this console, you can buy it on the exchange as well, but good luck finding it with this EPG mod at a reasonable price, because this console cannot be re-engineered, so if you get one with a mod that isn't one that you want, you just have to make another one. Because you can't re-engineer these things, it actually makes them kind of worse than the isomags, because with the isomags you can at least re-engineer to something kind of useful and then sell them. With these, you're stuck with whatever mod you get. Now there are more basic versions of these consoles just called particle generators. These will also buff your exotic particle generator skill, but as you can see, it is noticeably smaller than the one off of the Field Exciter. There's also a Bellum version of the particle generators that you can get in the Dill Store of the Discovery Reputation, but the extra crit chance really doesn't make up for the smaller EPG buff. The next console is the DPRM off the Atlas Prototype Dreadnought. This one is pretty much here for the same reason why it's always here, the bonus damage buff that it offers, and the massive amount of hull regen it gives is always good for a panic button. Next is the Agony Redistributor off of the Terran Adamant Heavy Raider. Like with the DPRM, this one is here for the same reason that it's usually on any kind of build, in its case for distributing damage from one target to several targets. Now, because EPG builds are already very AoE heavy, this means you'll be able to kill reasonably sized groups of enemy targets all at once rather quickly. Next is the VAQ Warhead Multiple Launch System off of the Texas American Worker Escort. The main reason this console is here is to trigger universal designs, because this is one of those consoles that can slowly build up charges rather than just having a strict 2-minute cooldown, so it's really useful for triggering that Starship trait. This also works for building up stacks for the passive off of the Cutting Tractor Beam console. Could use Immolating Phaser Lance instead, but that's also a very expensive console, and really this ends up doing more damage on its own, and because they both do the same thing, and this one does more damage on its own on this build, this ends up working out better. And the nice thing about the VAQ is that its recharge time is spaced out so that you can literally just spam this thing. You don't have to worry about timing it a little more precisely like you do with the Immolating Phaser Lance. With this, I can just leave this on my spam bar and go. Alternatively, you could also use the Pavo Crystal Prism console to trigger universal designs. It also has that similar charge-up mechanic, but that won't do nearly as much damage as either of the other two options. And the last console on the build is the Fakiri Torment engine. This is really good for buffing a lot of your damage over time effects, particularly the non-hazard damage over time effects, but it's also capable of buffing several of your exotic damage types, like fire, radiation, plasma, and physical. Because EPG builds are very reliant on damage over time effects and exotic damage, this is really good to have. Additionally, it can also create its own fire damage, which is going to be buffed because this is all exotic stuff. Moving on to the specializations, this ended up just being my usual Intel primary, temporal secondary. Initially, I was actually planning to use temporal as the primary specialization, but was actually advised against it because of the skill Anomaly Leash. What this does is that it allows your anomalies to slowly move toward whatever target that you are targeting, and that actually sounds fairly good, but it actually proves to be more of a pain in the butt than you'd think. Typically with a Gravity Well or any other anomaly abilities, you want them to stay put, so them even slowly moving around can actually prove more hazardous to your damage than anything else. The temporal specialization doesn't really have any other skills in the tier 3 or 4 sections that really help out with this build specifically. Temporal crosswiring would be kind of nice for a do-side build because it increases firing cycle haste anytime you use exotic damage abilities, but this isn't a do-side build, so that's not really going to help here. And frankly, it's only 4% firing cycle haste, so even on a do-side build, it's really not that big of a deal. Moving on to the personal space traits, there are going to be some familiar personal traits in here that I've used many times, but there's going to be some stuff that I have not used before in other videos. Because this is the first EPG build I've done on the channel, I'm going to go over all the traits this time instead of just putting the usual suspects on the screen. First is Adaptive Offense, which is a crit chance buff that stacks and then turns into a crit severity buff. A lot of these crit chance and crit severity buffs do apply to your exotic damage as well as your weapon damage. Context is for kings because it can either be a damage resistance rating buff or a bonus all damage buff. Both of these come from the Infinity Lock boxes. Fleet Coordinator for more bonus all damage based off of my team size. You get this one just through leveling up. Particle Manipulator increases the crit chance and crit severity of my exotic damage abilities. This one you can unlock by leveling up the Science School in the R&D crafting menu. Resonating Payload Modification gives a stacking debuff to physical and kinetic damage resistance to enemies. This one's mostly going to be helping out the torpedoes and mines more than anything else, but physical damage is a form of exotic damage, so there are a few things on the build that will be dealing that as well. Hot Pursuit increases the chase distance of your mines. Now, initially I was actually against using this one. I didn't think it was that necessary, but then I started playing around with it a bit more, and it really did help out the damage for the mines in certain situations. Mines typically only have a 2.5 kilometer chase range, but this will up it to 5 kilometers, which is actually a pretty decent distance. With Intel Agent Attaché, whenever one of my weapons scores a critical strike, this will help lower the cooldown of my captain abilities. I actually debated on whether or not to include this one or not, because one, this isn't a weapons-based build, so my weapons aren't going to be critting that much more often, and additionally, the captain's abilities on an engineering character really aren't that beneficial to an EPG build. But at the same time, there are still a few on here that are pretty helpful, like EPS Power Transfer is going to be really nice for further increasing my aux power. And even though this isn't a weapons-based build, Intrusive Energy Redirection's bonus damage buff is still pretty valuable to have. These last three all drop from the Infinity Lock boxes. Projectile Training is here to further buff my projectile weapons, those being my torpedoes and mines. I know I said this isn't a weapons-focused build, but they are still part of the build, so buffing them is still going to be important. And it is hard to say no to a bonus damage buff. The standard version of Projectile Training you can unlock just by leveling. The superior version can be purchased from the K-13 fleet holding. The last three are Terran Targeting Systems for the buff to my crit severity, Unconventional Systems to further help out with the cooldowns of my Universal consoles, and last is Enlightened, which gives a buff to exotic damage and hull regeneration. The exotic damage buff is only Cat 1, so it's not super amazing, but, it's better than nothing. These last three also drop from the Infinity Lock boxes. Moving on to the Starship traits, first is Subspatial Warheads off of the Sona Intel Battlecruiser. With this ability, anytime I use Torpedo High Yield, I am able to spawn a subspace tear anomaly. These tears will deal a small AoE of physical damage all around them, and can be quite powerful on an EPG build like this. Normally I use this build on torpedo builds because I can spawn a lot of those subspace tears with those, and they end up doing a lot of damage. With this build, I'm not going to be able to spawn quite as many of them because I've only got the one source for Torpedo High Yield. This build will be buffing the subspace tears that much more because it's all physical damage, which is all exotic. Next is Improved Photonic Officer off of the Tholian Niktomi, and this one's kind of a must for science builds like this. What Improved Photonic Officer does is extend the duration of the Bridge Officer ability, Photonic Officer. So with this, I'm able to keep Photonic Officer up nearly 100% of the time, meaning it will be continually lowering the active cooldowns of my other Bridge Officer abilities. There is no way to lower the cooldown of Photonic Officer itself, so the only option you have is to just extend its duration with the Starship trait. I know there's an old duty officer out there that says it can lower the cooldown of both Photonic Officer and Photonic Shockwave. It lies. That was before Photonic Officer got revamped. When it did, they made it so that nothing could lower its cooldown, and for some reason never updated the tooltip to that old duty officer. Additionally, this trait will give a bonus damage buff to my exotic damage while Photonic Officer is active. It'll also buff shield and hull healing, but it's mainly the exotic damage we care about. The next is the Ruin of Our Enemies off the D7 America Worker Flight Deck Carrier. This is here for the same reason it's always here. The stacking bonus all damage buff that you get for every time you kill an enemy, which can stack up to 100 times. Additionally, with every 5th enemy I kill, this will also help lower the cooldowns of my Bridge Officer abilities. So with this plus Improved Photonic Officer, I have my Bridge Officer cooldowns totally set, which is why I'm not using Boimler effect in the personal traits. Next is Assimilated Power Conduits off of the Tal Shiar Adapted Battlecruiser. With this, every time I use Emergency Power to Auxiliary, this will grant me some extra crit chance and crit severity to my exotic damage abilities. Spore-Infused Anomalies off of the Somerville Intel Science Vessel is pretty much a given on any science build. With this, anytime I activate a Science ability or Intel Bridge Officer ability, it will add a great deal of electrical damage to my anomalies. Trick I was taught with this thing, you want to make sure you get your temporal anomalies out first before you're able to start triggering the Starship trait, because those temporal abilities won't trigger the Starship trait. So you want to make sure those temporal abilities are out there first, and then you can start triggering the electrical damage on them by activating the Science abilities. Next is 5 Magics off of the Hysperion Intel Battlecruiser. Much like the console, this will be really helpful for buffing fire, cold, electrical, radiation, and psionic damage. The way it works is anytime I deal one of those damage types, it will buff those damage types. The size of that buff will scale with my engine power. So even just sitting here with my engine power at 94, 5 magics will give a 29.22% bonus damage buff to all of those 5 damage types, plus Disruptor. Not that I'm using Disruptor on this build. And the last Starship trait on here is Universal Designs off of the Crossfield Refit, which, again, is here for the same reason that it's always here, is for the stacking crit chance and crit severity buff. In the Space Reputation traits, the first here are just for crit chance and crit severity, so that's Advanced Targeting Systems, Tyler's Duality, and Precision. But then I've also got Auxiliary Power Configuration Offense. With this, I'll be getting bonus all damage based off the level of my auxiliary power, and Particle Generator Amplifier for some more bonus exotic damage. Moving on to the Bridge Officer seating. In this Lieutenant Commander Universal, which I am using for more science seating, first is Tachyon Beam. This is a drain ability that will drain enemy shield power, but the main reason this is here is for triggering the radiation damage on the secondary deflector. The same is true for Charged Particle Burst. Both of these are good for triggering the radiation damage on the secondary deflector. Tachyon Beam has a pretty low cooldown, so you'll be able to use that one fairly often on a single target. Charged Particle Burst is a bit longer, but it's an AoE attack, so you'll be able to hit multiple enemies at once with it. And in the Lieutenant Commander spot is Photonic Officer 2 to lower the cooldowns of my other Bridge Officer abilities and to trigger Improved Photonic Officer. In the tactical seat, first is Chemosite Lace Weaponry 1, which will give some extra radiation damage to my weapons. Because I'm using nothing but projectiles as weapons, that will have a guaranteed chance to trigger that extra radiation damage, whereas with energy weapons, it only has a 10% chance to trigger. Next is Mine Dispersal Pattern Beta to get some extra mines, and Torpedo High Yield 3 to buff my torpedo weapons and to trigger subspatial warheads. Next is the Lieutenant level Engineering seat. Now, engineering seating on a science vessel is a really big deal because generally, the more engineering seating you have, the worse that science vessel is. There are so very few engineering abilities that have any sort of benefit to an EPG build. Emergency power to auxiliary is obviously rather helpful, but that's about it. There are no engineering anomaly abilities, there are very few engineering debuffs, none of which will trigger the secondary deflector. You can get healing abilities from better sources. Engineering abilities are just not set up to help out exotic builds. Even the ones that seem like they are meant for it seem to constantly underperform. See, I thought I was onto something when I found Malicious AI, because this deals both exotic plasma damage and radiation damage. These are dealt as damage over time effects, and if the ship that you put this dot on is destroyed, it will move to another ship. It honestly sounded pretty great, but in my testing of it, this thing did absolutely horrible. Seriously, this thing does radiation damage and plasma damage. It should be doing way more damage than it actually does, but nope, this is abysmal. And it's a real shame too, because if you could actually get some decent damage out of this ability, then engineering seating on science ships wouldn't be nearly as debilitating as it is now. But as usual, engineering is the class of suffering in Star Trek Online because we're not allowed to have anything nice. But yeah, I wanted to show that off for the sake of the video, but once I'm done with this, I will likely be replacing this with emergency power to engines for the extra speed buff. Moving on to the Commander Science/Temporal seat, first is Heisenberg Amplifier and Chronometric Inversion Field. Not only are these unconventional systems triggers, but they are also temporal anomalies. So by getting those out there and then triggering spore-infused anomalies, these will do a good amount of electrical damage. And then you can follow that up with Gravity Well, which is also an anomaly ability, so you get some decent control out of there, as well as some more electrical damage. And then of course there is Recursive Shearing 3. Putting this on a target will cause it to store up damage from any source that that target receives, and after a bit it'll deal all that stored damage all at once as physical damage, meaning this can potentially deal a great deal of damage in one single hit. And then lastly, in the Ensign seat is Tractor Beam 1. For the duty officers, things are a little different in here. I've got some of the usual suspects like the projectile officers for buffing crit chance and crit severity, 27 to 47 for more crit severity, and of course 26 to 47 for buffing damage over time and critical chance. But I've also got a unique technician down here that will increase exotic damage every time I use emergency power to auxiliary, and a gravimetric scientist that is capable of triggering aftershock gravity wells, meaning it has a chance to trigger smaller, weaker gravity wells next to my normal gravity wells. Alright, now let's move on to the ISE and then the combat analysis. In this random ISC, I did just under 800k, which is about what I expected to do in this. This is a rather high-end build using a lot of high-end stuff, so yeah, 800k is definitely in that window that I would expect to see in this. Though, if I'm honest, the whole thing felt kind of sluggish, and I think that's more just me not being used to activating my abilities in the proper way that I need to be ordering them in. I think I just need more practice with EPG builds, so honestly, I feel like I could probably get that a bit higher. You can see the bulk of the damage was done by pet damage, but again, that makes sense with Agony Redistributor being on the build. I was actually kind of surprised how well Breath of the Dragon did. Like, I was expecting it to do pretty well, but not 127k well. Over in the pet damage, you can see the Bioelectric Wave did about 70k. Like I said, that thing hits like a truck. Just a shame it is held hostage on such a horrible ship. And even the VAQ warheads did just under 50k, which put them just ahead of the Isolytic Tears, which that actually kind of surprises me. I'm normally accustomed to seeing the Isolytic Tears do more damage, but at the same time, I'm also normally accustomed to using them on torpedo builds. I also ran this thing through a Jupiter Gauntlet Elite, in which I only got 551k, which that actually seemed a little low to me. This goes back to what I was saying earlier, where things felt kind of sluggish at times, but I think it's just me being out of practice with EPG builds. I'm so used to just being able to spam a bunch of stuff with my energy weapon builds that with this I have to be a little bit more mindful of my timing with my consoles and other abilities. But of course this wouldn't have been a problem if the Premonition had just been a temporal battlecruiser like it should have been.
So yeah, that is the EPG build I have put together on the Premonition with a lot of help from Galactic Gaming. Thank you again. As I said, the Premonition probably isn't the #1 ship to be doing this sort of build on, but, you know, no ship is absolutely perfect. And, you know, yeah, the Chekhov and definitely the Vern would probably be better, but I like the Premonition, so I want to see if I can do, you know, the best I can do in that ship. With that said, I still think Premonition should have been a temporal battlecruiser. Anyway, let me know what you thought of the build or the ship itself down below in the comments, and while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. If you would like to further support the channel, you can hit that join button, or you can find the merch store down below, or if you're ever shopping on the Epic Game Store, be sure to use my content creator code STU1701. Any of those really help me out, and I really do appreciate it. Either way, though, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.